Sometimes the truest things arrive without fanfare. No grand entrances, no declarations. Just a chair pulled a little closer, a cup placed quietly within reach, a gaze that doesn't flinch. That's how it begins. Small, steady offerings that made the quiet feel less like a cage and more like a room with a window. The days had a way of slipping past in gray ribbons then, but his presence didn't try to color them. It simply shared the gray, sat inside it, and proved that even muted light can be kind. There were long afternoons when the clock seemed louder than a voice, breaths went shallow, thoughts insisted on their own gravity. Questions hovered unsaid, like birds that couldn't land. He didn't rush them, he made space for them. There was a gift in his not knowing, a reverence in the way he left room for what couldn't yet be spoken. No coaxing, no pressing, a soft, consistent nearness that felt like a hand open, palm up, waiting. Rather than a hand that closed, it became a ritual he'd arrive with something simple, a folded blanket, an orange peeled in spirals, a memory about the weather from the week before. He treated small things as if they mattered, and because of that, small things began to matter again. The first time a laugh slipped out, it surprised both of us. It was a small sound, the kind that might have been mistaken for a caught breath. He didn't seize it, didn't say there it is or finally. He let the laugh be a shy animal and returned to the trees. The next time, it stayed a second longer. Silence has textures. There's the brittle silence that cracks when touched, the kind that dares any word to break its hard shell. There's the smothering silence that presses heavy on the chest. And then there's the slow, breathing silence that allows two hearts to hear each other. He helped me find the third kind, not by instruction, but by rhythm. He sat when I sat, walked when I walked. In the kitchen, he'd lean against the counter while the kettle built toward its little crescendo, and we'd watch the steam make ghosts of itself in the light. It felt like watching proof that even what vanishes can be beautiful while it's here. When memories arrived, they did so in fragments. A door slam from somewhere in the building, the metallic clink of keys. A scent that hauled a year behind it. He never asked for details. He learned the way my breath shifted before a wave came, how my shoulders rose as if they could hold back water. He learned the difference between wanting to be held and wanting a whole room's worth of space. He listened with his eyes, with the pause before he spoke, with the way he'd set something down gently, not because the cup was fragile, but because the moment was. There were days of rain that sounded like applause from another world. On one of them, he took me to the window and tapped the glass softly. "Hear it," was all he said. The question wasn't a question. It was permission to be in the world again, to let sound wrap around the fear without arguing with it. We stood there, two silhouettes in a simple room, and the rain did the speaking. I leaned into the hum of it and realized I'd been waiting for a language that didn't accuse me of being too slow to heal. Trust didn't return like a parade. It arrived like dew. Mornings revealed it. Little beads gathered overnight on the edges of routine. The first time I reached for his hand, it was to steady a glass on a wobbly table. Our fingertips touched, that was all. The current that ran through me wasn't fireworks. It was recognition, a quiet oh, somehow even that felt like a triumph, a choice made not out of desperation, but out of a growing belief that gentle could be safe. He had this way of honoring stories without demanding the plot. On a late evening walk, the streetlights threw soft halos on the sidewalk. Shadows made lace around our steps. Sometimes I forget how to say the simple parts. I said, the words surprising my own throat as they left. He nodded as if I'd told him the weather. Simple parts know how to wait. He replied, it wasn't advice. It was an invitation to stand with me on the threshold of saying more without crossing it before I was ready. My heart unclenched another notch. There were moments I tried to pull away from what was good, as if goodness were a trick with a bill to pay later. He didn't romanticize my fear or diminish it. He treated it like weather. Storm coming, his eyes would say, let's make tea. We'd do ordinary things while the inner sky shook itself out. Fold laundry, sort the mail, watch the dog across the street, negotiate the leash with his owner like it was a philosophical debate. Life, in its minor chords, kept playing. It felt like healing without the pressure to heal, movement without the demand to arrive. The first story that left my mouth came in jagged edges. It wasn't linear. It wasn't complete. He followed the fragments like a map drawn by a trembling hand. When my voice failed, he didn't step in with his. He let the failure be holy, a stopping place rather than a cliff. I watched him choose, again and again, to be a witness instead of a savior, a presence instead of a solution. That distinction rebuilt something lost, autonomy, the kind that makes a person stand a little taller because standing is chosen, not forced. Love began to feel like a bench in a public garden, available, unowned, warmed by the sun. It held the weight placed upon it without complaint. It didn't keep score of who sat longer. It didn't ask to be admired for supporting us. It just existed, sturdy and ready. I began saving little evidences of that love. The note he left on the fridge with a doodle of a lopsided star. The way his shoes always pointed toward the door and then slightly back. As if halfway out he remembered the joy of staying. The playlist he made labeled Quiet Rooms. That never once told me how to feel. It would be hard to explain to anyone who loves the spectacle of grand gestures that the turning point arrived on a Wednesday evening at the sink. The faucet squeaked. The plates clicked together in the warm water. He was drying, I was washing, and a question surfaced that used to make my chest burn. What if it happens again? I asked, not specifying the it. Old pain has many costumes. He didn't offer guarantees he couldn't keep, didn't swear allegiance to outcomes no one controls. He held the towel, met my eyes, and said, if it comes, we won't pretend it isn't here. I'll be here too. The promise wasn't to fix the future. It was to stand inside it with me. That was enough to loosen the knot under my sternum that had sat there for years like a stone that refused to be named. There were still nights when sleep wouldn't come. On those nights, he'd read the first page of a dog-eared book I loved as a child, over and over, as if the beginning were a place I could live until morning found me. He knew the way my breath would lengthen by paragraph 3, how my fingers would unfurl by paragraph 5. Sometimes I didn't sleep. Sometimes I just felt less alone in the not sleeping, which turned out to be its own kind of rest. Little by little, silence changed its allegiance. It stopped siding with fear and started siding with love. The quiet between us wasn't the absence of language. It was the presence of understanding. In that quiet, I learned to hear myself again, to trust the pulse in my own wrists, to believe that the body knows when it is safe. The first time I sang along softly to a song on the radio, almost under my breath, he didn't clap or make a joke. He reached out and traced the air, a conductor with no orchestra, and let the melody be ours, unclaimed and free. The greatest tenderness was how he never made healing my debt to pay back with happiness. He loved the person in front of him on the days joy ran quick, and on the days grief sat heavy. He kept choosing ordinary, which turned out to be extraordinary in a world addicted to highs. He kept showing up, not to rescue a damsel or author a miracle, but to be the kind of constant that makes courage possible. And in that steady warmth, pain took off its armor and began to breathe in a way that sounded like life. This is how presence became love. There was a kind of quiet only he could hold, not the heavy kind that swallows sound, but the kind that makes space for breath. Every time words tangled in the throat, every time emotion blurred the edges of thought, he waited not as someone waiting for a story to end, but as someone honoring the moment it began. He didn't look away when silence grew long. He simply stayed inside it with a patience that felt almost sacred. There was no urgency to fill the air, no nervous laughter to soften the weight, just eyes that said, "I hear you, even when you don't speak." It started with small things: the tremor before a word, the shallow inhale before courage. He noticed everything: the way fingertips fidgeted with the seam of a sleeve, how sentences began with maybe when the truth felt too large, how laughter carried an ache underneath it. Most people listened to reply. He listened to understand, and somehow that made every unspoken thing feel a little less unbearable. He didn't ask for the story all at once. He gathered it slowly, piece by piece, as though each word was something delicate he might break if he moved too fast. Some nights, conversation wandered like wind, soft, aimless but warm. The kind of talk that drifts between memories and dreams, never quite landing anywhere, yet meaning everything. He'd ask simple things: what makes you feel safe? What sound do you miss most? Questions without pressure, questions that invited truth instead of demanding it. And when answers came out clumsy or incomplete, he never tried to finish them. He'd smile and say, "You don't have to make sense to be understood." That one line lived in the heart long after the words faded. There was one evening when everything inside broke at once. The dam that had been holding back years of unsaid things finally gave way. The words spilled out in fragments: Haft, Ruth's gasps, and tears that refused to stop. It was messy and raw, the kind of confession that doesn't ask for forgiveness, only release. He didn't reach to hush it, didn't pull closer or turn away. He just listened, fully, quietly, completely. Every tear that fell was met with stillness, not pity. Every pause was met with breath, not advice. When the room finally went quiet again, he said the softest thing imaginable: "You don't have to carry what hurt you alone." And for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt safe. His way of listening changed everything. It wasn't just about hearing, it was about witnessing. The kind of listening that says, "I see what you're not saying." He could tell when thoughts drifted somewhere painful, even in laughter. He'd reach out not to stop it, but to remind that the present moment was still here, still gentle. Sometimes all he did was brush a strand of hair aside or trace the edge of a wrist, grounding everything back to now. He never asked for explanations. He understood that some wounds speak their own language. When joy returned hesitant and unsure, he listened to that too. He noticed the way the voice lifted when talking about art, the sudden light in the eyes when a favorite song played, the laughter that cracked open after months of silence. He celebrated each small return like a miracle, without making it feel like a performance. "You sound lighter today," he'd say with quiet pride. It wasn't about being fixed, it was about being free. There were moments of complete silence, late nights under dim light, the kind of stillness that holds more emotion than any words could. In those moments, connection became almost tangible, like air that hummed with recognition. Every unspoken story, every hidden ache, found a place to rest. Love grew not from grand declarations, but from listening, really listening, until two hearts started to breathe in rhythm. Listening became an act of love, deeper than any touch. It was the way he leaned forward slightly when something hurt, how his eyes softened when emotion cracked the voice. It was the way he let pauses stretch long enough for truth to find its shape. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes it took days. He gave both. When silence lingered, he'd hum a tune, low, steady, familiar. It wasn't meant to fill the gap. It was a reminder: you're still here. I'm still here. That's enough. And then, somewhere between all that quiet, something shifted. The walls built from fear and memory began to thin. Words that once hid behind hesitation started to step forward, trembling but brave. He never made promises he couldn't keep, never swore that pain would vanish. What he gave instead was something more: honest consistency, a love that didn't flinch at the hard parts, a patience that didn't expire when the healing took longer than expected. He taught that being listened to is not the same as being heard. To be heard is to be known to have someone catch the unspoken meaning between breaths and hold it gently, without judgment. His love did that. It listened to the spaces between words, to the sighs that ended conversations, to the tremor that started them. In that attention, wounds began to soften, fear began to loosen its grip, and the heart once afraid to speak began to trust sound again. There were no grand gestures, no poetic lines rehearsed for effect, just a kind of everyday devotion that spoke louder than any vow, the way he waited at the door when storms came, the way he let silence stretch without mistaking it for distance, the way he remembered small details, how hands always searched for warmth, how eyes drifted left when memories hurt too much. His listening became a mirror, reflecting back the pieces that were forgotten or denied. Through him, love became a gentle teacher, showing that understanding doesn't need to be loud to be profound. Even in the quietest moments, his presence said everything words could not. That's what love truly sounded like, not noise, not promises, but presence. The kind that made it safe to unravel without fear of falling apart. The kind that healed, not by changing what was broken, but by honoring it until it no longer needed to hide. And in that kind of listening, love found its purest voice, steady, patient, endlessly human. It wasn't about skin meeting skin. It was about something quieter, deeper, something that lived beneath touch. The kind of connection that didn't ask for proof or performance. It simply existed, humming softly between two hearts that had learned the language of stillness. It began with a glance, not one that burned, but one that lingered, steady and sure, as if it was mapping the invisible spaces time had carved. There was no rush, no hunger to claim, only the calm ache of recognition. A feeling that whispered, I know you. I remember you from somewhere the world can't name. The first time hands met, it wasn't even intentional. A brush of fingers across a table, brief but electric, like a pulse skipping a beat. It wasn't desire that made it powerful, it was meaning. The realization that touch didn't have to demand it could listen. That simple brush held everything unspoken: grief, gratitude, longing, the slow rebuilding of trust. It was an invitation, not a promise, a question, can you stay? And the answer came in the way those fingers lingered, not grasping, not taking, just being there. Nights together were quiet. Sometimes the air between breaths felt more intimate than words. There would be a lamp burning low, the sound of rain against glass, the smell of coffee cooling between them. He would look over, and in that gaze lived an entire universe, not of possession, but of peace. It felt like home, the kind that didn't lock doors or demand reasons for leaving, the kind that existed simply because two souls had decided to rest in the same light. He understood silence differently. Most people filled it. He listened to it. Sometimes the quiet would stretch long enough to hear the small sounds, the rhythm of breathing, the creak of old wood, the heartbeat that softened with nearness. He'd reach across the couch, trace the edge of a sleeve, and that tiny gesture would say more than entire paragraphs ever could. It was never about taking. It was about offering warmth without condition, safety without expectation. There was a night when tears came without warning. No words, no explanations, just the kind of crying that rises from the body before the mind understands why. He didn't ask questions. He simply leaned close, his presence grounding everything that threatened to fall apart. One hand rested over another, not to stop the trembling, but to remind that trembling was allowed. In that closeness, the air felt thick with honesty. Every unspoken sorrow found room to exist. Every breath carried the weight of release. That was love in its truest form, being held by understanding, not by hands. The beauty of what grew between them was that it never tried to outshine pain. It sat beside it. When fear returned, and it did, sometimes suddenly he would look up with those eyes that didn't panic, didn't flinch, just stayed, and somehow that steadiness made it possible to breathe again. Trust didn't rebuild itself in a day. It rebuilt in moments like that, in the simple act of staying. In the shared heartbeat between two people who had learned to count time not by seconds, but by the softness of presence, When laughter returned, it came gently, the kind that starts small, uncertain, like light peeking through curtains. It filled the spaces that once felt unreachable. He had this way of smiling without moving his lips too much, as if afraid that too much joy might scare it away. That restraint made it even more beautiful. There was something sacred about the way they cherished the small things, shared glances, unspoken jokes, the comfort of existing together without explanation. Sometimes they'd walk in silence through empty streets, shoulders brushing, steps falling in rhythm. The night air would be cool, and the world around would shrink until it was just them, two quiet souls walking through the sound of their own breathing. There was no need to hold hands. The connection pulsed through the space between. Every movement carried awareness, every glance a promise that didn't need words. The heart spoke through gestures, the tilt of a head, the slowing of a step to match the other's pace. Even the smallest motions became an expression of care. There were moments of vulnerability too, moments where the past returned sharp and vivid. In those times, he would simply reach out, fingers brushing along the forearm with a kind of reverence, as if to say, "You are still here. You are real, you are safe." And in that simple act, walls that had stood for years began to crumble, not with force, but with gentleness. Love didn't tear them down, it waited patiently while they dissolved on their own. On mornings when sunlight poured through the curtains, everything felt softer. The world outside seemed irrelevant. Words were few, but glances were plenty, warm, lingering, tender. A cup of tea placed by the bedside. A quiet good morning, spoken like a prayer. In those small exchanges, there was intimacy deeper than touch, a knowing that went beyond the physical. The body spoke through stillness, and the heart answered back with calm certainty. This is what safety feels like. There was one afternoon that lived like a dream, sitting by the window, watching dust float in golden light. He reached for a notebook and wrote something quietly, sliding it across the table without a word. It was a single sentence. "You don't have to be loud to be heard." That line stayed, echoing in places where fear once lived. It was more than reassurance, it was truth. Their love didn't roar, it breathed. Every shared moment, every quiet exchange became a mosaic of trust. It wasn't built on passion alone, but on presence. There was beauty in restraint, in knowing that closeness didn't always mean touching, that love could exist entirely in the space between two heartbeats. And in that space, something eternal was born, not fire, but warmth. The kind that doesn't burn, only glows, the kind that lasts. It wasn't about bodies aligning, it was about souls recognizing. The way he looked without needing to speak, the way silence became a comfort rather than a distance, that was the truest form of intimacy. It lived in every heartbeat shared, every sigh understood, every pause honored. And when the world grew quiet around them, that love continued to hum softly, not needing proof, not seeking witness, only existing, pure and unbroken. Sometimes love doesn't touch, it listens, it breathes. It waits, and in that waiting, it becomes everything. What once felt numb began to bloom again. Not all at once, not in some cinematic rush of color, but slowly, like frost melting at the edges of morning light. It started with something almost unnoticeable, laughter that didn't feel forced, eyes that stopped avoiding mirrors, breaths that didn't shake. For the longest time, the heart had been quiet, not empty, just tired. And then, gently, it began to move again, like a bird testing its wings after too long inside a cage. His care wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with promises or grand gestures. It lived in the everyday, in the way he asked how the day felt rather than how it went, in the way he remembered to leave small lights on when nights felt too heavy. He didn't try to fix what had been broken. He simply made it safe enough for healing to happen. It was strange how safety could feel like sunlight, something warm and constant that didn't demand to be noticed but changed everything it touched. Under that light, pieces once buried deep began to stir. There were days when emotion came like a tide, washing over everything unpredictable, uninvited. The old fear whispered that too much feeling would lead to pain again, that stillness was safer than joy. But he stood steady through every wave. No matter how rough or silent the waters became, he never drifted away. Sometimes he'd just sit beside, letting the quiet be its own kind of language. There was no pressure to be better, no rush to move on. Somehow, that patience became the rhythm that rebuilt trust, slow, deliberate, kind. Music returned first, the kind that fills a room not with sound, but with memory. Songs once avoided began to feel less like reminders and more like rediscovery. He'd hum softly when working, unaware that the sound alone could make walls feel less like barriers. That hum carried something sacred, a reminder that not everything lost stays gone. Some things just wait for gentler hands to call them back. He had a way of turning silence into something living. In his presence, even wordless moments had shape, a shared breath, an exchanged glance, a quiet understanding that didn't need translation. The quiet that once felt suffocating began to feel holy, like a space where wounds could breathe. Love didn't arrive with thunder, it arrived with listening, with waiting, with being, and slowly numbness began to give way to color again. One evening, as dusk folded over the day, a small confession slipped out, fragile, trembling, unplanned. It wasn't a story told to impress or seek pity. It was truth, raw and unfiltered, the kind that makes the air between two people feel thin. He didn't rush to respond. He simply took the moment in his hands and held it gently, as though afraid to crush it. Then, in a voice softer than the evening itself, he said, "You don't have to be who you were before. You can just be." That single sentence became a seed that rooted itself deep inside, a permission to start again, not as a version of the past, but as something entirely new. Fear began to lose its shape after that. It didn't vanish, but it stopped defining everything. Where it once built walls, he built windows. Through those windows came small things: sunlight, laughter, shared cups of tea, plans for nothing in particular. There was no grand transformation, just the slow, ordinary kind that changes everything quietly. Joy crept in through the cracks, subtle, steady, unannounced. It came in the way mornings felt lighter, in how smiles arrived without rehearsal, in how dreams no longer felt foolish. Distance, too, began to dissolve, not just the distance between two people, but the distance between self and life. There was a time when connection felt impossible, when every touch, every word, felt like walking barefoot on glass. But his gentleness had a way of reminding that closeness doesn't have to hurt. It can be safe. It can be simple. The heart, once wary of being seen, began to open, not all the way, but enough to let warmth in. Enough to trust that being known wasn't a danger anymore. It wasn't rescue. He never claimed to save anything. What happened was quieter, a kind of resurrection that grew out of being seen, not fixed. Love, real love, doesn't arrive to replace brokenness. It arrives to remind that broken doesn't mean unworthy. He showed that even the cracks could hold light, that the parts once deemed unlovable could be touched with tenderness instead of judgment. That realization felt like breath after years underwater, disorienting, beautiful, free. In the small moments, a shared meal, a walk in the fading light, the simple act of two people sitting side by side with nothing left to prove transformation became visible. The heart no longer flinched at affection. Laughter came easier. Tears, when they came, no longer felt like defeat. They were cleansing now, not collapsing. Each day brought a little more color, a little more warmth, as if the soul was remembering what it meant to feel alive. He once said that love isn't a cure, it's a mirror. It shows what's possible when kindness replaces fear. And he was right. In his care, everything softened. The sharp edges dulled, the shadows grew less haunting, the silence turned melodic. Life began to hum again, gently but persistently, like something reborn. It wasn't the old self returning, it was something entirely new blooming in the space where pain once lived. There are still moments of stillness, of remembering. But even those no longer sting, they shimmer, because love left traces not of dependence, but of freedom. It proved that even in ruins, beauty can grow, that even in the quietest heart, warmth can return, that even broken things can be loved back to life. If this story touched something inside you, don't let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe, because here, love isn't just told, it's felt. Every week, another heartbeat, another healing, another truth whispered softly for you. Stay close, keep believing real love always finds its way home.